Let's examine the world of Columbus Day and look at his impact on the Americas. Let's look at the world he did not discover, what he actually did, and he should be credited for this. He set in motion the exploitation of two continents from European domination. He never set foot on North America or South America. He set in motion an attitude that is still with us, a concept called divine white right and something else called manifest destiny. The assumption was because Europeans had the ships and the basic technology, they had the right to go into other people's country and exploit their mineral resources, take their women and rape them all at will. They did all of this in the name of God that they said was merciful and kind. All of them, including the Arabs, used Western-oriented religions which made their God ungodly. Now, the role of religions in the domination and destruction of African civilizations was ruthless. There is no exception. Islam was as guilty as all the rest of them. The role of religion in this matter is so shameful that no matter how you look at it, the picture is negative. All of them did more harm than good. Now let's look at the world from 1400 to 1600 before they came to what is called the New World, which was not new at all. During the Crusades, the Europeans had exploited each other to the point where Europe was about to explode within itself. The Catholic Church, in its need for funds to build these massive cathedrals and to support parasitic priests, had begun to fleece the people to the point where the faithful began to have some serious questions about the role of the church. The church, in its desire to get still more money from the people, created something called purgatory. Now, when you died, you didn't go directly to heaven, you went to purgatory. Your family and friends had to ransom you from purgatory. The more money you gave the priest, the harder and quicker he prayed to get grandma and uncle from purgatory into heaven. It was a religious con game played on the people of Europe. They were beginning to discover this game to a point, and out of anger, Europe was about to explode within itself. Then a fortunate incident would happen. An offbeat, beatnik hermit named Peter came across Europe saying that the infidel Arabs were barring Europeans from visiting the holy places. Observing the Holy Grail and visiting the place of the crucifixion, Michael Bradley, in his book Holy Grail Across the Atlantic, has proven that there was no Holy Grail in the first place, and it wasn't lost in the second place, and it wasn't where they thought it was in the third place. The Pope saw a reason he could use to cut down on all of this anger against the church. The propaganda swept through Europe that they had to move across Europe in a crusade to rescue this mythological Holy Grail that wasn't lost in the first place. Now they're starting to march, moving across Europe to the rescue. However, in the movement across Europe, they forgot the pent-up anger against the church. This gave the church a new lease on life which would last until the rise of Martin Luther, who would then challenge the church again and lay the basis of Protestant Reformation. There were many crusades and many reasons for people going on crusades, none of which had anything to do with religion or God. The way the story is presented to you in school, you think it has something to do with holiness. It has something to do with European power and Europe rising from the Dark Ages. It has something to do with Europe's search for something outside of Europe to eat. Something to do with European emotionalism bending itself on people outside of Europe, and something to do with Europe trying to find a scapegoat for its own anger. Europe was trying to deflect the fact of its own enslavement of other Europeans. The way they would call it feudalism, but it was an enslavement. It was European enslavement of other Europeans. The Crusades won all the battles in Cecil B. DeMille's movies. He gave them victories, but in many cases, in real history, they got the hell beaten up out of them. These well-dressed lords took with them common, ordinary people to do their work and their laundry. These common, ordinary people saw these lords with their tails being beaten and on their knees begging for mercy before the alleged infidel Arabs. They began to understand that these men who owned land and controlled their lives were less than God. In the meantime, back in Europe, some of the young lords had given up privilege that the old lords was hanging on to, the privilege of first night. If you lived on the lord's land and you married, he had the privilege of spending the first night with your wife. Some of the young lords had conceded that the poor critter should at least have the privilege. Now, when the old lords came back into Europe, where was a semblance of human recognition for the serf, the white slave, on the plantation, The semblance of human recognition would lead to more demands. It would lead to a fight against child labor. While it didn't lead to the banishment of prostitution, it would lead to workhouses and places where they could at least put people out of sight. Europe had lost 1/3 of its population through famine and plagues. On the eve of 1400 AD, this is the sight you see in Europe, far less in creature comfort than anything in Africa and Asia. They were engaged in tribal warfare in Europe, as they are engaged in genocidal conflict right now. Only in Europe you don't call it tribal warfare. You will not deal with the fact that not only what is happening in Russia today is tribal warfare, it is partly race war. You forget the millions of Asians who went into Europe and didn't go home. Asian men who came without women and didn't go home to satisfy their biological necessity. Indeed, if it is a necessity all the time, that's another lecture. I think we overdone that assumption. What is always a biological pleasure is not always a biological necessity. Let's at least concede that much. These Europeans intermingle with these Asians to create a European ethnic entity that is still in Europe. Europe was still hungry and awakening. While it was awakening, it began to pay some attention to the new light in Europe, Spain. Spain was then dominated by Africans, Arabs, and Berbers. This combination of Africans, Arabs, Berbers, and Jewish financial managers known as grandees were totally in control of Spain, parts of France, and Portugal, where the Africans and the Arabs had lost power in 1240 AD. However, in 1415, the Portuguese got up enough nerve to attack a small place on the coast of northwest Africa, present-day Morocco. It was a place called Ceuta. As battles go, it wasn't much of a battle, and as places go, it wasn't much of a place. I visited the place, and some say it's about the size of Central Park. I walked all over it. It's not big as Central Park. The Battle of Ceuta was a turning point. After 711 AD, when Jebel Tariq, an African general of Tariqa bin Zayed, led an army into Spain. Spain had been under the domination of Africans, Berbers, and Arabs. Europe had lived in fear of what they referred to as the infidel Arabs in the Mediterranean. Europe being blocked from the trade in the Mediterranean cringed, and it was the Arabs that drove the Europeans to the so-called Middle Ages by destroying the European market into the Mediterranean. The Battle of Ceuta asserted the European, and subsequently they began to claim access to the Mediterranean. By 1455, arguments between the Arabs and Africans over patriarchal approaches to women and Islam had weakened the Africans' Arab hold on Spain in the Mediterranean. When the Africans join a religion, he is a Puritan within that religion. Other people join a religion and use it for their best interests. But when the African joins it, he takes it for its purest form. I have said before that we African people will out-pope the Pope, and we out Muhammad in matters pertaining to both religion and political ideology. Spain and Portugal would now approach the Pope, and the Pope would say to them, "You two good Catholic nations, stop fighting among yourselves. You are both authorized to reduce servitude all infidel people." You should read Eric Williams' Capitalism and Slavery. A lot of people think it's an old chestnut. This book, written over 40 years ago, is still current and relevant in its information. Breon David, a scholar at Cornell University, wrote a book called Slavery and Western Civilization. That book is 3 times larger and says less. The forgotten character has not been taken into consideration. I'm still on my way to Christopher Columbus, Prince Henry the Navigator. Prince Henry got hold of a catch of maps which were mostly made by Jewish gold dealers who had been dealing in the Western Sudan and the coast of West Africa. The Western Sudan is comprised of the nation in inner West Africa as opposed to the coastal nations of West Africa. Europe is beginning to see the shape of certain parts of Africa. They are no longer guessing on all of it. Prince Harry now, with these maps, began to open up a school for chart making and map making to let Europeans know something about the other parts of the world. I recently appraised a book they call Prince Henry, the Initiator of the Slave Trade, which is inaccurate. He did set European maritime skills in motion, using the maritime information the Africans and the Arabs had preserved at the University Salamanca, Spain, Europe would now go back to sea. It had previously forgotten longitude and latitude. In other words, when they put a ship out to sea, they wouldn't know which way to turn it. They didn't know east from west. That challenge from Mediterranean Africans, the challenge of the Moors, the challenge of the Arabs, had driven Europe into the Middle Ages and had dulled the sense of Europe to the fact that they lived now in fear. Prince Henry, while called the Navigator, didn't navigate anything, and there is no evidence that he ever went to sea. The main thing Prince Henry did was to introduce Europe to maritime information. The European in turn used the maritime information coming out of China, then the leading maritime nation of the world, to go out to sea again and to get rid of some of the old wives' tales about the sea. Some of the tales were that if you go so far that the sea drops off, the world was flat, not round. The European had begun to make up his mind, all the hunger, all the famine now that he had ships and guns. The European didn't care what shape the world was in, round or flat, he wants it all. Round or flat. Sometimes African people approach European power brokers with the assumption that Europeans are going to give us back things that they had already taken from us. They took it from you. You got to take it back. There is some indication that a little-known sailor, Cristobal Colon, Christopher Columbus, attended one of Prince Henry's schools of chart making. There he learned the basics of maritime skills. We have no evidence that he had or ever had any command. This gets us into a mystery about Columbus. Michael Bradley in New York called the Columbus conspiracy found so much dirt under the name Columbus, he maintains that there were two Columbus. No one man could have been capable of that much dirt, according to Bradley. This includes 7 illegitimate children. When he is faced with the different children that were born and the women, he couldn't have moved that fast from one to the other. If he seared one over here, he couldn't have gotten to another place enough to bring another one into the world. We have to deal with another date neglected in history, 1482. Ships laying off the coast of what is now Ghana, earlier the Gold Coast. They insist now on building permanent fortifications. Portuguese ships had been coming along that coast since 1438. They would take a few slaves out of the country, 1442. The Portuguese king, seeing Africans so well dressed and seeing them bringing presents, assumed that they were visiting royalty and in turn gave them presents and sent them home. The idea of enslavement had not reached his mind.